I'd like to welcome everyone to this webinar on PRB's newest Engage presentation. Thank you for taking the time to participate, and a happy World Population Day to everyone. My name is Marissa Pine Yeakey. I'm a Senior Policy Analyst with PRB, and I was actively involved, along with several of my colleagues here at PRB, in developing this presentation about the demographic dividend that we're talking about today. There are a few webinar logistics to note before we begin. If you would like to submit a question, please use the questions pane in your GoToWebinar control panel because there will be no audio interaction with you during the webinar. So if you ask a question just into your microphone, we won't be able to hear you. You're welcome to submit questions at any time, though I will save them and respond to as many as possible during the Q&A portion at the end of the webinar. If you have any technical difficulties during the webinar, please submit a question and we will try to answer it immediately. My colleague, Taijen Tsai, is standing by to help you troubleshoot if need be. If you have a mobile phone or other electronic handheld device, please move it away from your speakers as it can affect your ability to hear the webinar. And finally, you might want to consider closing any other programs that are open on your computer because they may interfere with the quality of your connection. If you're having trouble seeing or hearing the webinar, please let us know, but be aware that the problem may be due to the quality of your internet connection. So getting started, we'll begin with an overview of all of PRB's Engage presentations and what we mean by an Engage presentation. And then we'll discuss the specific presentation we're sharing today, which is Harnessing the Demographic Dividend. We'll show you the full presentation and then review the accompanying materials, such as how to download the presentation files and what's available in the user guide. Finally, we'll end with some time for me to respond to questions that arise. So to begin with, what are these Engage presentations? PRB's Engage presentations are dynamic, multimedia presentations for policy communication about family planning and reproductive health issues. Many of these presentations feature Trendalyzer, which is a data visualization tool to explore the relationship between different indicators over time. And you'll see Trendalyzer featured in the presentation a little later. These presentations are designed to engage high-level leaders in critical conversations about family planning, reproductive health, and development. Through the presentations, complex research and data are distilled into simple messages and graphics, enabling leaders at all levels to grasp the evidence base for investment in health as a key development strategy. And finally, Engage presentations are intended to be useful advocacy tools, so they're available online for people to download and use as part of their own work. This presentation was developed with funding from the USAID Office of Population and Health through PRB's IDEA project, which is informing decision makers to act. Through this project, we aim to increase support for policy audiences for effective health and population programs around the world. The goal of harnessing the demographic dividend is to improve the audience's understanding of the demographic dividend, what it takes to realize that dividend, and the potential for the countries of sub-Saharan Africa to achieve the demographic dividend and associated economic growth. To achieve this goal, the presentation is designed to promote policy dialogue on the critical role of declines in fertility, changes in population age structure, necessary investments in family planning, health, and education, favorable economic policies, and good governance practices for achieving sustainable economic and social development. There are several different target audiences for this presentation. The primary audience is government policymakers in sub-Saharan Africa who are in a position to allocate resources and advance strategic investments on the policy agenda. Secondary audiences include all of those who influence high-level and government policymakers, so that might include the news media, civic or religious leaders, program officials, and other types of community and opinion leaders. This presentation is a tool that you can use to reach any of those audiences with messages about the demographic dividend and the investments needed to spark a dividend. For example, you might use the presentation with a group of regional policymakers to address the common misperception that a large youth population in a certain region will automatically translate to a large working population that can spur economic growth. Or you might use the presentation with civic and religious leaders to educate them about the importance of family planning, child survival, and girls' education to produce beneficial health and development impacts in your community. So as you watch the presentation, I'd like you to consider how you might use the presentation yourself as an advocacy or educational tool to reach a specific audience or group in your country. I'll go through the full set of materials for this presentation in detail a little bit later in the webinar, but I do want to give a brief overview right now. The presentation is available in two formats, both of which you can download from PRB's website. One is a narrated video, and that's what I'm about to show you during this webinar. The other format is a clickable presentation, similar to PowerPoint, which you could stand up and deliver live to an audience. In addition to the presentation itself, we have a user guide available which provides instructions and support materials to use the presentation. All of this is available on PRB's website in English right now, but the French materials are forthcoming within the next month. So without further ado, here is Harnessing the Demographic Dividend, narrated by Sheila Macharia of USAID Kenya. And please excuse a slight delay as I disconnect my microphone and configure the audio for this video.
Policymakers are talking excitedly about harnessing the demographic dividend for economic growth in their nations. With so much positive development underway, such as increases in education, improvements in health, and reduced poverty, many people believe that accelerated economic gains are right around the corner. But with almost 2 out of 3 Africans still living on less than $2 per day, much remains to be done. The demographic dividend is the accelerated economic growth that can happen as the population age structure changes, together with strategic investments in health, education, economic policy, and governance. But by no means is a demographic dividend automatic. The starting point is the population structure and how many dependent children there are in relation to the older working age population. As the number of births each year declines, the young dependent population grows smaller in relation to the working age population. With more workers and fewer young people to support, a country has a window of opportunity for accelerated economic growth known as the demographic dividend. Let's take a closer look at changing population structures in 2 countries, Thailand and Rwanda. We are going to start with Thailand's population pyramid in 1960. Each layer of this diagram is an age group, and the width of each layer represents the proportion of the population in that age group. It looks like a pyramid because when couples have many children, more people are added each year in the younger age groups at the base of the pyramid. In 1960, more than 40% of Thailand's population was under the age of 15, and women had an average of 6 children. During the 1960s and the decades that followed, mortality rates declined, desire for smaller families increased, and investments in family planning enabled rapid declines in fertility. By the 1990s, women were having an average of 2 children each, and as a result, population growth slowed. By 2010, Thailand's population was larger, and the age structure was transformed with a smaller population of young people. This change in the age structure helped accelerate economic growth. Today, Thailand's population is dominated by working-age adults who will be part of a productive labor force for many years. Let's now turn to Rwanda, a country that has made great progress over the last decade in improving health, lowering fertility, and increasing economic growth. Like much of Africa today, Rwanda's age structure is young, with 40% of the population under the age of 15 and an average of 4 to 5 children per woman. Even with Rwanda's progress, the age structure will stay young for several decades. In 2030, if fertility continues to decline to close to 3 children per woman, 35% of Rwanda's population will be under the age of 15, a higher percentage than in any country, including Thailand, that has realized a demographic dividend. In Rwanda, and in many African countries that have not made similar progress, getting from here to here requires 3 key investments. First, improve child survival. In many African countries, more than 1 of every 10 children dies before they turn 5. Improving child health services allows more children to survive and leads to couples desiring smaller families. Second, space births and prevent unintended pregnancies. Currently, more than 50% of African women who don't want to become pregnant are not using a modern method of contraception. Increased investments in family planning will prevent unintended pregnancies, leading to fewer births per woman. Third, educate girls. Throughout Africa, only 1 out of 3 girls of secondary school age is enrolled in school. But when girls stay in school, particularly through secondary level, they are more likely to delay early marriage and childbearing and have healthier families. Together, these investments lead to lower fertility and mortality and enable the population structure to change, opening a window of opportunity for accelerated economic growth. We can see how declining fertility is related to economic growth in countries around the world on our Trendalizer graph. On the left axis, we have the average number of births per woman, which we call the fertility rate, going from 0 up to about 8. On the bottom, we have the gross national income, or GNI per person, ranging from 0 over to about $40,000 US. This is standardized for what a dollar can buy today in each country. The color of each bubble indicates the region. Starting with the red, we have East Asia and the Pacific. Orange is Central Asia and Europe. Yellow is for North and South America. Green is the Middle East. Light blue is for South Asia. And the dark blue is for Africa. The size of each bubble represents the population size of that country. So, bigger bubbles have bigger populations. The year is 1980, and through the middle you can see a trend. As the average births per woman declines, the income per person rises. But we see that the dark blue African countries are clustered toward the back of this trend, with higher levels of fertility and lower levels of income. Let's look at a few of these countries. In 1980, fertility in these countries ranged between about 5 and 8 children per woman. Income was between $200 and $2,000 US per person. Although we are only focusing on a few countries, This represents the range of the majority of African countries in terms of fertility and income in 1980. Let's bring back the rest of the countries and see what has happened since 1980. You can see the trend over time, that countries are lowering fertility as they move down on the graph, and at the same time, income per person is increasing as they move toward the right. When we come to 2010, the world is a very different place. We see that the African countries have made a lot of progress, though many are still clustered toward the back of this pack. But a few African countries have made strong progress in both lowering fertility and increasing income per capita. So let's go back and look at two of those, Botswana and Tunisia, to see what happened over time. In 1980 in Botswana, women had an average of 6 children each, and the income per person was almost $1,600. In Tunisia, fertility was slightly lower, just below 6 children per woman, and income was slightly higher, almost $1,900 per person. Let's see how things have changed. You see, income increased right away in Botswana, and although there are some bumps along the way, fertility is falling very rapidly in both countries. Although Botswana's rich natural resources have enabled economic growth, it is Botswana's sound economic policies and social priorities that have led to gains for development, and the country is internationally recognized for good governance and low corruption. Tunisia was one of the first countries in Africa to adopt a policy to reduce fertility in order to accelerate social and economic development. Both Botswana and Tunisia have long prioritized education for both boys and girls and have steadily invested in access to healthcare. Comparing today with where these countries started in 1980, we see that families have 2 or 3 fewer children. Income has increased, such that families in Tunisia have an average of 5 times the purchasing power, while in Botswana, families have 9 times the purchasing power compared to 30 years ago. These dramatic changes at the family level represent significant growth and development for the entire country. Learning from the successes of countries like Tunisia and Botswana, we can see a pattern of investments which are necessary to harnessing the demographic dividend. Although lowering fertility and changing the population structure is the necessary first step, investments in health, education, economic policies, and good governance allow the changing age structure to be transformed into accelerated economic growth. A healthy population contributes directly to higher economic growth and poverty reduction. Improving children's health, such as through immunization and nutrition programs, sets the stage for healthy adulthood. Ensuring that children have adequate nutrition from pregnancy through age 2 can have a profound impact on their ability to grow, learn, participate in the workforce, and rise out of poverty. Yet, 1 in 5 children in Africa is moderately or severely underweight. As children become adolescents, ensuring continued access to health services, including reproductive health and family planning services, helps them to delay childbearing until they are ready. It will also help them avoid HIV and sexually transmitted diseases, enabling youth to stay in school and transition to healthy, productive adults. Promoting healthy lifestyles keeps adults productive and participating in the workforce and economic growth of the country. At the same time, investments in education are critical to seizing the opportunity of a healthy workforce. Investments in schooling and expansion of secondary education will ensure that a country has a skilled workforce for future economic growth. Right now, many countries struggle to provide quality primary schooling. But as a population growth slows, many African countries will have more resources per child for education. Governments must seize this opportunity by expanding access to education. Educational systems must also be responsive to the labor needs of an expanding economy. These investments in education can have quick returns for individuals and families. Each year of schooling is associated with an increase in wages of up to 10% or more. And improving the education of young people today means a higher quality workforce in the future. With additional training and skills, young people will be equipped to compete in the global economy. Yet, dramatic variation in secondary school enrollment across Africa suggests uneven opportunities for achieving a dividend. In West Africa, only 27% of secondary school-age girls and 37% of boys are enrolled in school. But in Southern Africa, 92% of girls and 88% of boys are enrolled. Improving secondary school enrollment, especially for girls, will accelerate progress towards the dividend. But to fully realize the benefits of the investments in health and education, they must be accompanied by supportive economic policies that create jobs for today's large population of youth and harness the power of the age structure transformation. With fewer children and higher levels of education, more women can transition to paid and higher skilled jobs. Sound economic policies will increase meaningful employment by fostering growth in the skilled workforce. Governments must shift economic priorities into sectors that can absorb today's youth, such as manufacturing, service, and technology. Governments must ensure that women and men have equal opportunity and skills for the workforce. Sound economic policies also promote free trade and open markets, attract foreign and domestic investment, and help grow the private sector. And there must be attention to fostering personal savings and expanding access to economic opportunities for rural and poor communities through microfinance and targeted programs. Finally, good governance practices, including rule of law, stability and security, efficiency and accountability, along with strong and transparent institutions, are essential to harnessing the demographic dividend. Indeed, good governance is a vital ingredient that turns the wheels of progress and engages the power of the demographic dividend. Each of these areas of investment contributes to transforming the possibility of a demographic dividend into the reality of accelerated economic growth. It starts with a change in the population age structure, which hinges on lowering fertility through access to voluntary family planning, improved child health, and education. Investments in health services and education foster a healthy, productive, and skilled workforce. Economic policies foster job growth, trade, and foreign investment, while good governance builds civic participation and confidence in the government and social institutions. Each sector is important for economic development, but no sector alone can transfer the momentum of the age structure transformation into the economic growth of a dividend. All of the gears must work together. As each component fits into place, the gears begin to turn and engage, pushing the nation forward to the promise of accelerated development and prosperity by harnessing a demographic dividend.
If you have questions about the content of the presentation, I'll be able to answer those at the end of the webinar during the question and answer session, but you are welcome to go ahead and submit your questions at any time if you have any. So what you just saw was the narrated video of harnessing the demographic dividend. It is an MP4 file format, which should play on most computer media players like Windows Media Player or QuickTime. The file is 290 megabytes, so it's a large file. And if you have a poor internet connection, it might be hard to download the file. It might take you a few tries. The other format that's available is the clickable presentation so that you could stand up and deliver the presentation live yourself. This file is a Flash format, and it is a 58 megabyte file. This file functions very similarly to a PowerPoint in that you can use the forward arrow on your computer to advance one slide at a time as you deliver the presentation. The user guide, which I'll discuss in a few minutes, includes the complete script for the presentation. So between the user guide and the presentation file, you'll have everything that you would need to give the presentation yourself. This format of presentation differs from PowerPoint, however, in that you are not able to edit or modify the presentation at all. You won't be able to add or remove any slides, and you won't be able to change the content of each slide. All of these materials can be downloaded from PRB's website, and when the French versions are available in the next month, they'll be downloadable from the same place. So in addition to the two formats of the presentation that are available, we have a user guide to help you use the materials effectively. So what you see here is our standard Engage user guide, which includes instructions that are relevant to all of PRB's Engage presentations. This includes an explanation of the technology and the file formats that we're using, instructions on how to set up both the narrated video presentation and the clickable presentation. And the user guide also includes some overall guidance on delivering effective presentations and being a good presenter. The presentation guide for harnessing the demographic dividend, which is what you see here, contains the information that a user would need specific to the content of this presentation. This is a separate document from the standard Engage presentations user guide, and both are available on PRB's website. In this user guide, we address the presentation goals and intended audiences and uses. We include the script for the presentation if you want to deliver it yourself. We include a handout that you can use and questions for discussion with an audience, and a section on frequently asked questions, or FAQ. And we also include the full references to the data sources used in the presentation and a listing of additional resources that you may want to consult to learn more about the issues and research raised in the presentation. The user guide starts with an overview of the presentation goals. So what you see here is a visual of the actual user guide, and this summarizes what I shared at the beginning of this presentation about the key messages and target audiences for the presentation. I know you may not be able to read this text, but my goal is really just to walk you through the user guide and let you know what's available so that you can go back and access it later. Under opportunities to give the presentation, this guide summarizes the target audiences for the presentation and offers some examples of how and why you might try to reach a selection of audiences with the messages in this presentation. The next part of the user guide is the presentation script. This is the complete script to narrate the presentation just as you heard it now. What you see on the left is the presentation script, how it appears in the user guide. And if you wanted to deliver this presentation live using the clickable presentation file, you can just follow this script in your delivery. You can see that the script is formatted with an arrow and the words click forward and a number. Every time you see that in the script, you would advance the presentation by one slide using your keyboard arrow and then read the text that follows. The numbers correspond to the slide numbers, which appear in the bottom right corner of the clickable presentation. And what we've added there is a screenshot of the presentation. So you can always confirm that you're reading the correct narration for each slide. So for example, right now we're looking at slide 4, and you would want to ensure that you're reading the narration for slide 4 in the script. So all you need to do to deliver this presentation yourself is to have the script in front of you and open the file on your computer. Then you click the forward arrow, read the script, and click forward to the next slide. And if you wanted to modify the script or revise the language to make it more comfortable for you or add some anecdotes or additional data about your country, you would of course be able to alter the script and do that for yourself. The next section of the user guide covers handouts. So what you see here is the first page of a 6-page handout that is included in the user guide. You can photocopy or print copies of this handout to give to your audience if you were to use the presentation. The handout includes snapshots of the presentation visuals along with some text about the key concepts. In addition to this handout, the user guide includes some instructions for creating a customized handout of relevant indicators using PRB's Data Finder, which is available on our website. Creating a customized handout won't include the visuals and the layout that you see here, but it does allow you to select the data that is relevant to the presentation and specific to your country or context. This will help you to connect the messages in the presentation with the evidence that's relevant to the context for your audience. So for example, for this presentation, you might use Data Finder to pull the population size, a population size projection, the total fertility rate, and the use of family planning among married women for your country. And then you could share that with your audience in connection with this presentation. Next in the user guide, we have a set of questions for discussion. After sharing the presentation with your audience, you would probably want to engage them in some discussion about the key issues that were raised. You may have ideas of your own questions, which would be great, but the user guide also offers some suggestions of questions that you might ask to get your audience talking. For example, you might ask your audience for ideas on how they can get today's leaders interested in making investments that might not pay off in return for 5, 10, or even 20 years, such as the type of investments and returns for a demographic dividend. And of course, you can choose to ask your own questions of the audience instead. We also have a section on frequently asked questions and responses, or the FAQ. After seeing the presentation, the audience may ask questions about the data, the concepts, or the issues that were in the presentation. And this section should help you to anticipate some of the more challenging questions that the audience might ask and offer some suggestions on how you might respond. You can certainly choose to respond to questions in your own way, but we hope that by reading this section in advance, you would feel confident to respond to any of the questions that would arise. Finally, I'd like to draw your attention to PRB's Engage Snapshots. As I explained at the beginning of the webinar, although a few of you may have missed this, our Engage presentations are multimedia tools for policy communication and advocacy around critical issues in family planning and reproductive health. Harnessing the Demographic Dividend is one of these presentations, and others are available on topics such as youth, sexual, and reproductive health, family planning and poverty reduction, and family planning and gender. In addition to those presentations, which are all about the same length as what you saw today, we have a series of Engage presentation snapshots, which are short 2 to 4 minute multimedia videos. These are also available on PRB's website, although they're only available as narrated videos. They are much shorter and more focused than the larger presentations. And within the next month, we'll be adding a few snapshot videos that are adapted from Harnessing the Demographic Dividend, that are just some short videos that really focus on the key concepts that were shared during this presentation. These short videos can be downloaded in the same way as the full presentation, and they can be easily embedded to play as videos within a PowerPoint presentation. So this makes them effective tools for enhancing your own presentations if perhaps the full Harnessing the Demographic Dividend presentation is not the right choice for you for a given audience or opportunity, but you still wanted to incorporate some pieces, some of these snapshot videos might enable you to do that. And because they're so short, these videos are smaller file sizes, which makes them much easier to download, to stream online. They're also very easy to share online. So as I wrap up this portion of the webinar, I want to remind you of the intended use for this presentation, Harnessing the Demographic Dividend. This is a multimedia advocacy tool that we hope advocates, educators, and all of you will be able to use in your work to help the key audiences of high-level leaders and decision makers, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, to understand the concept of the demographic dividend and the investments that are necessary to create a dividend. As an advocacy tool, the presentation is available on PRB's website, along with the user guide materials to help you share the presentation with audiences and spark dialogue about the role of health investments, such as in family planning, child health, and girls' education, and how those investments play a critical role in development. If you are actively involved in advocacy for family planning in your country, you may want to look at the Family Planning Advocacy Toolkit that is available through the K4H project. This toolkit includes a wide set of resources for effective family planning advocacy, and it includes this Engage presentation as a part of that toolkit. So we are now at this portion of the webinar where I can respond to any questions that you might have. If you do have questions about the presentation materials, the presentation itself or the content, or any of our other Engage materials, please go ahead and type them into the questions pane of your GoToWebinar control panel. I'll do my best to respond to all of the questions in the order that they're received, but I apologize in advance if I'm not able to get to them all in the time that we have remaining. If there are any outstanding questions when we wrap up in about 10 or 15 minutes, I'll try to respond to them in the future and share those responses with you over email. So it looks like a few questions are coming in, and I'm trying to get up to the top of them. So the first question that I have here, it says that the presentation assumes that current resources dedicated to youth are accessible and sufficient to meet the education and health demands of even a smaller population. Isn't the amounts currently allocated the most significant factor? And that may be an assumption, and I think we realize that in many different contexts, the resources dedicated to youth currently are not accessible or sufficient, but we would hope that countries would be able to scale those up over time, and the ability to scale up those resources and meet the needs will be much easier achieved if those youth populations don't grow at such a high rate as they are in many countries right now. The next question asks about European countries and some of the challenges that some European countries have run into as their youth populations have gotten smaller and they've gone through a demographic transition. And that is a concern. However, the reality is that for many countries, the time involved in achieving a demographic dividend and transitioning to a very small dependent youth population is extremely far in the future. And if countries are able to make the investments right now that will spark that change and invest in health and education and family planning, they will start to enable a transition in their country that will be able to support an elderly population. So a country's ability to realize A second dividend that we talk about sometimes with the accumulated wealth of older populations is also an important factor. And to realize the second demographic dividend that can come about with a wealthy and stable older population includes encouraging and supporting workers to accumulate personal savings and other assets so that those workers are less dependent on social services for support in their later years. Governments must begin planning for this now, and the accumulation of wealth must begin early if the aging population is to be transformed into the drivers of a second demographic dividend. So that's an important factor to keep in mind as countries think about the potential of reaching a demographic dividend and what that might mean for the long-term stability of their country. So the next question I have here, somebody is asking, which of the four sectors a country should develop first? Is it the education, the health, the population, or the governance? And that's really a challenging question. And we talk about the population structure as sort of the first factor that can kickstart a demographic dividend. So it is very important to invest in that population structure gear that you saw in the presentation first with girls' education, child survival, and family planning. But the reality is that governments really need to be investing in all four of those gears at the same time, because it's not a stepwise process. It's not that you can address population structure and then move on to education and then health, but you really need to address all of them at the same time, and the benefits of investing in all of them will start to be seen across sectors and enhance development. I have a question here about the age of marriage and how we did not address the age of marriage in the presentation. And the person is wondering how much a change in the age of marriage of 1 to 2 years would impact the population age structure and potential to reap the dividend. And that's definitely an important factor. If increasing the age of marriage by 1 to 2 years happens across a country, that often leads to a delay in childbearing of 1 to 2 or more years, and that can help to expand the range of the generations and reduce the rate of population growth. So that's certainly a factor, and it corresponds to keeping girls in school, and so that's why we really chose to focus on education for girls, because keeping girls in school is a very important factor in the discussion of age of marriage and early childbearing. And so that's a concrete investment that governments can make that can start to address the age of marriage as well. I have a question here about how can I get the data for Tanzania and other African countries? And that's a great question. A lot of the data that was shared in this presentation is available from publicly available sources. So you can get online to PRB's data finder, and there are instructions in the presentation user guide about how you could do that. Through PRB's data finder, you can get information on the population size, population projections, growth rates, family planning use, and a lot of the types of indicators that were shared in this presentation for countries around the world. And so we encourage you to see how your country compares to some of the indicators that we shared in this presentation today and see what you think about your own country's potential for achieving a demographic dividend. The next question asks if there's a bibliography of the technical literature on the subject. I won't say that we have a comprehensive and exhaustive bibliography of the literature, but in the user guide we do include a great deal of information about the sources and references. So if you were to look at the user guide at the end of the script, we have a list of the references for the specific citations that we make in the presentation. At the end of the user guide, we also have a section on additional resources, which includes many of the sources that we cited in the presentation, as well as what we consider some very comprehensive and informational resources that you could look to gain more information about this subject.
I have a question that one of the animated scatterplot graphics from the presentation, and I think you're referring to the Trendalizer graphs that were the animated moving bubble graphs showing the changes in income as relationship changes in TFR was very useful, and asking if that graphic alone can be embedded in a PowerPoint and shown. So as I mentioned at the end of the presentation, we have these engage snapshots, which are forthcoming. There's a series of them that are available on PRB's website right now, and a series of short snapshot presentations based on harnessing the demographic dividend will be posted over the next month. And one of those short snapshots includes that series of the Trendalizer graphic and all of the animation included in that. It will be posted on PRB's website and available to download, so you can take it and use it as needed. And we also include instructions on PRB's website for how you could embed that into a PowerPoint presentation. It will only be available as a narrated video file, but of course you could choose to silence your computer and narrate it as you wish if you were going to embed that into your PowerPoint. So keep an eye on PRB's website for more materials forthcoming. I have a question about the development of this presentation, and were we able to test the presentation with priority audiences to identify possible obstacles or specific recommendations? And we did. We were able to test the presentation with a few sets of developing country audiences in sub-Saharan Africa, in Malawi and in Kenya. The majority of those very official pre-test audiences were not policymakers, but they were the groups of people who are doing advocacy with policymakers in their country and have a strong handle on what the policymakers respond to and what are the messages that they'll listen to. As we finalized the presentation, we had the opportunity to share it at the joint African Union and UN Economic Commission on Africa meetings in March. And we shared the presentation with a group of policymakers from around the region who were discussing development and specifically the demographic dividend. And so we shared the presentation with them, and we had some very positive feedback. They understood the presentation, they responded effectively to the messages, and in the statement that came out of that meeting, they addressed the demographic dividend and some of the investments that were necessary to move African countries toward achieving that. I have a question going back to the Botswana example. And although Botswana started with a higher fertility rate, it also had very high national income in the 1980s. And that's certainly very true. And the same can't be said about the other sub-Saharan African countries. And the person is asking if governance might not be the cardinal issue here. And that's absolutely the case. Governance is a key component of the gears and the puzzle that we shared here on the demographic dividend. But as we said, there's no one issue alone that is really going to transform countries and create the type of economic growth that is associated with a demographic dividend. So governance is absolutely important, and it needs to be a part of the equation, but so does investment in health, education, and a changing population structure, as we shared in the presentation. At PRB, our expertise falls much more on the population structure side, and so you may have sensed that that was where the emphasis of the presentation fell, and that's certainly the case because we are demographers and public health professionals, and so that's the piece where we can really contribute a lot to this discussion. Some of the additional resources included in the user guide come from the World Bank and other organizations such as that, and focus a bit more in depth on the governance piece of this puzzle. And so you might want to look into those resources for additional information about the role that governance can play. And I have a question about how easy is it to use the Trendalizer to pull specific country data. And it's really quite easy. The Gapminder World website, which is the organization that created Trendalizer and has given PRB access to use it in our work. It's a very user-friendly tool, and you can go to gapminderworld.org and explore Trendalizer, choose your own indicators, choose your own countries, and there's a lot of instructions and guidance on how to do that on their website. I think that is about all the time that we have available for questions, unfortunately. Thank you for all of the questions, and I know that there are a few I wasn't able to respond to. I will try to follow up with those individuals and respond to their questions afterwards. As we wrap up, I want to thank all of you for taking the time to participate in the webinar, and I apologize again for the audio issues that we had at the very beginning. We did record the webinar, so we'll follow up with you in a few days to provide a link where you could download this recorded webinar and go back to it. And that recorded version of this webinar will include all of the key links that you see here so that you'll be able to go ahead and access all of the materials that we discussed today. If you do have an opportunity to use this presentation or any of these materials, we would love to hear about it. You can contact me directly at myeakey@prb.org, and I would love to know how you used the materials, what the outcomes were, and how we can better support your work with data and materials about family planning and reproductive health. Just before we end, I would like to acknowledge my colleagues Jason Bremner, Jay Gribble, and Kate Gillis, who all worked on developing this presentation here at PRB. I'd also like to acknowledge Chai-Jen Tsai of PRB's Communications Department, who played a key role in producing this webinar and making all of the materials accessible. And finally, a happy World Population Day to all of you. That concludes our webinar. Thank you so much.